Good morning, and welcome to Calvary Covenant Church Online. My name is Kendall Churchill, and as always, it is so good to be with you. Back in the 1940s, after World War II, there was a new race taking place, a race to see who could be the first one to break through the sound barrier, to travel faster than the speed of sound and create that infamous sonic boom, to go at Mach speed. Well, there were all sorts of airplanes being designed and pilots wanting to do this, but it was an uncertain task. Could it be done? So pilots, they would take their airplanes and they would be going faster and faster and faster, 0.8, 0.85, 0.9, 0.95. As they would get closer and closer to breaking the speed barrier, their airplanes would start shaking more and more, and they become destabilized, and it'd be really unclear if the plane would be torn apart. And so the pilots, when the shaking got really bad, they would pull back. They wouldn't say, "Oh, this is too risky, too dangerous. I can't face this." And so they wouldn't make it through the sound barrier. Well, there was one pilot named Chuck Yeager who faced the same challenge. In his plane, as they was getting closer to Mach speed, the plane would shake, and it was unclear if the plane would be torn apart or what would happen. But instead of pulling back and slowing down, he pushed forward to go through the turbulence, to face the uncertainty. And he is credited as the first one to go Mach speed to break the sound barrier. In doing so, breaking through the turbulence came a new stabilization, a new peace. It was sort of this, if you could get through the fear, you could reach the new success. Now, heroes are people who oftentimes deal with this sort of thing, where they have difficult decisions, where others are afraid to move forward, where they pull back. Heroes, they go through. They move forward. They face the uncertain, knowing that there might be something better up ahead. Now, the Bible is full of these sorts of heroes, people who have to make tough decisions or are uncertain how it's going to turn out, but step forward in faith anyway. And there's one book of the Bible, one story that we're going to look at today that gets into that, and that's the story of Esther. Now, just some context on this book. It takes place after the great kings of Israel, but before the time of Jesus. The great high empire of Israel had been defeated. It had been torn down by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, and more recently, the Persians. And the Persians, they were better than the Assyrians and the Babylonians, but they were still being ruled by him. It wasn't a great situation to be in. The Jewish people had been defeated and had been in exile. They were rather weak. They weren't doing very well. And so they're finding themselves in just a really rough patch of history, being ruled now by the Persians. And the Persians were led by a king named King Xerxes. Now, outside of the Bible, we have different stories about King Xerxes, and he wasn't a great guy. In fact, King Xerxes was known for his great fury and anger. One story tells that after he had a failed invasion, he ordered his soldiers to go out and whip the ocean. Seeing that the ocean was responsible for his loss, he ordered that his soldiers whip it. Yeah. A real pleasant, great guy, really level-headed, not a hothead at all. I mean, King Xerxes, he had was not a really pleasant guy. The story of Esther begins, chapter 1, talking about how King Xerxes is married to Queen Vashti, and King Xerxes throws this great lavish party. It lasts a whole week, and at the end of the week, after a week of partying and drinking and things like that, he says, "Hey, I have a great idea. I will bring Queen Vashti out, and I'm going to have her show everyone her beauty. Don't you want to see her beauty?" And Queen Vashti, when she's summoned to present herself before all of these drunk people, she goes, "No, that sounds like a terrible idea." And when the news comes to King Xerxes that Queen Vashti's not coming, he gets angry. But he doesn't ask Queen Vashti, why aren't you coming? Instead, he goes to his advisor and says, what should I do? And the advisors say, well, if word gets out that Queen Vashti refused you, the queen, then all the women of the empire will start refusing their husbands too, and we can't have that. So we need to get rid of her. And so it says that Queen Vashti was exiled. Some other texts suggest that maybe she was executed instead. Either way, bad ending for Queen Vashti. Well, the king now needs a new queen. And so he goes, what should I do? I know what to do. I will call all the eligible ladies to see who could be my queen. And so one young woman named Esther is taken and is put into essentially his harem for a year to get all these beauty treatments along with all these other women. And each night the king would get a new concubine. And if he really liked her, then she would become the queen. I know, not a great system. But Esther, she ends up being selected. She ends up becoming queen. She pleases the king. And things look like it might be okay. You know, don't get on his bad side, but maybe things will be okay. Now, at this point in the story, it should be pointed out that Esther and her relative Mordecai are sort of interesting people to be selected as heroes. I mean, God can use anyone. I mean, literally anyone. He doesn't look for perfect people, but what he does look for are available people, people who are willing to step up, who are willing to do the hard work, people who don't have it all figured out necessarily, but people who will be obedient. I mean, just look at Esther and Mordecai. During this time, the Jewish people were invited to return back to Israel. They didn't have to be in exile anymore, but for whatever reason, Mordecai and Esther decided to stay around in Persia. They decided to stay with the pagans, and there's no evidence that they knew or followed any of the Jewish traditions, that they celebrated any of the holidays, that they knew or even obeyed any of the laws. I mean, there was no real sign that they were religious or good Jews in any real sense. But Esther's chosen to be the queen, and news comes later that the second in control, second in power, Haman, he ends up really disliking Mordecai and wants to not just kill Mordecai, but all of the Jewish people. And so when this happens and the word gets to Esther, Mordecai says, hey, you know, if you can probably get away with being in your position, maybe, I don't know, because you've hidden your Jewish roots, but if you don't do anything, then God will either choose, someone else will be chosen to step up, or we'll get wiped out. But maybe you were put here for such a time as this. And so Esther's faced with a decision. She has a crisis of identity. Who is she? Where is her allegiance? What is she going to do? Is Esther Jewish, or is she Persian? Is her place with King Xerxes at the palace, or is it back in Israel with her people? Is her name Hadassah, her Jewish name, which means myrtle, a small tree, or is it Esther, a Persian name, which means star, which refers to her radiance? Is she going to follow God of her ancestors, or the God of the Persians? Who is she? Who is she going to be? She is faced with a crisis of identity, and she has to choose what she's going to do. And a crisis like this, they can do one of two things. They either confuse us and paralyze us, saying, I don't know what to do, I'm overwhelmed. Or sometimes crisis, they clear away the cobwebs. They make things really crystal clear and apparent who we are and what we're supposed to do. It's like everything fades away and you go, I finally get it. The story of Esther is about two queens. It starts with Queen Vashti and leads into Queen Esther. One queen refused to come when summoned, and another queen appeared to the king without being summoned. Both highly dangerous, risky things to do, especially with King Xerxes, one who's known for his fury and anger. And especially Esther, she knew what happened to the last queen. Vashti didn't go when she was summoned, and so she ended up having a bad fate. Esther, she knows if she goes to the king without being invited and the king doesn't approve, for her as well. This is really a high-risk, dangerous thing that she's going to have to do. If she is going to go before the king, she needs to know and be convicted that this was the right thing to do. Now, God sometimes shows us a crying need, a need that is great, and it pulls on our heartstrings. It, just goes, oh, I need to do something. And for Esther, when she hears that her people are going to have genocide committed against them, she's like, I need to do something. I don't know if it's going to work out for me, but I need to try. And that's the thing. Sometimes God, when he places that on our hearts, it gives us something to live for, a bigger purpose than just ourselves. And so both Vashti and Esther, they're heroes. They act in defiance of power, doing what they believe is right. Esther knew that doing the right thing was going to carry a high risk. And so she leans into it. She's brave. She pushes forward through the uncertainty, through the turbulence, not knowing what would happen. She goes before the king, invites him to a meal, where she invites him to another meal, and then in front of Haman, the king's second-hand person, the one that is probably like a best friend, accuses him. And Haman ends up being defeated. Haman is executed in the place of others. She chooses to be brave, and as a result, her people are saved. There's a good ending to this story, and sometimes God gives a prophetic word, a vision, making it clear, the burning bush, where miracles are performed, where you go, oh, this is a divine, special time and place, and it's so clear. But more often than not, God doesn't do things like that. Rather, we know what we're supposed to do, and we have a choice in whether or not we're going to do it. We know what's right, and we just have to act in faith to see how it will turn out. Now, most people, they don't like risk. They don't like taking chances. They want to feel secure before they make tough decisions. I mean, you don't want to gamble too much, because if you gamble, you might lose. And nobody likes losing. They know what the right choice is, but they fail to act because it doesn't mean they'll be completely comfortable. It means that you're going to be uncertain, that you will face destabilization. People don't want to face that. They want comfortable lives, ones that are super easy, without much inconvenience in them. They want to have lives of mild pleasures, where there's a certain mold of predictability. But God has such bigger plans for us. In the story, we see that God chooses and uses a deeply flawed family who have deeply divided priorities. And Esther, she didn't even know that there was a problem. She was married to the king, but she didn't even know that her whole family, the Jewish nation, was going to be exterminated until Mordecai came and told her. She was out of the loop. She was oblivious. God chose her to save the people, using deeply flawed people with divided priorities who aren't as clever as they think they are. Sounds a lot like us, doesn't it? We're exactly the kind of people that God uses to change the world. For us, though, what does it mean to have a divided heart? What does it feel like to have different allegiances pulling on our identity? Esther, she had a question of whether it was to be to the empire that she was a part of, or to the religious community and identity, that nation. For us, I think we sometimes have to ask, What are the forces that pull on us that say, you're either with us or against us? Are you part of our political, economic, social group? Are you part of this family, this company, this whatever it may be? What is your allegiance? Who do you give your time, your effort, your thoughts? Where does your allegiance lie? And you cannot be neutral in this life, because these different allegiances, they will conflict. You need to choose where your allegiance lies, where your heart is being pulled. What is shaping your identity? Who are you? Now, the good news is that you don't have to figure this out all on your own. Sometimes God breaks through our complacency, breaks through our apathy, breaks through our small lives of predictability. He shakes things up and says, I have a far greater purpose for your life. You have a purpose greater than yourself. Do you want to come with me? Do you want to be part of something amazing? In your marriage, in your family, in your church, in your community, in your nation, what are those pivotal moments? Those moments of realization, those moments of change, those moments where the turbulence is either going to destroy the ship or it will break through to a new stabilization. What are those moments? When you're in them, what does it feel like? What do you experience? What are you thinking about? Do you tend to pull back? Or do you lean into them? Esther, she knew that if she went before the king, if she pushed against Haman and his plans, she might die. She knew that there was a high risk of what might happen, but she counted the cost and said, I need to do this anyway. What are the risks if you realize it is your time to act with outrageous courage? What are the costs that you may have to pay? Is that something you're willing to do? Being a hero isn't easy. Being a disciple, a follower, being faithful to God isn't easy. If you want an easy life, this is not the right path for you. But if you want to be part of something bigger and greater, to make a difference, to have not security in this life, but in the next, then you have a direction, a path. In the book of Esther, God's name is never explicitly said. Instead, God is in the shadows. We see his hand guiding individuals and events and stories. We don't hear any specific saying, and therefore we will do and be this sort of person because God is so good. Instead, it says, God is there in the background. God's presence, in fact, is oftentimes just seen afterwards through the faithful responses of his followers. God calls and uses imperfect people, people who mess up, who don't do all the right things. God uses those sorts of people to change the world if they can face the turbulence, to defy those powers and authorities, to follow God and his commands, to trust in him. And so as you look for signs of God's direction in your life, as we talked about last week with Gideon, looking and listening for God's signs, as you look for them in your life, you're going to be asked to defy authority and power. You will be asked to make tough decisions. You'll be asked to put yourself at risk. But there is no greater stabilization and peace than sticking through the discomfort and experiencing that new serenity of stabilization in God's good purpose. Friends, I send you out this day with this blessing. May God the Father make clear in your heart what you are called to do. May Jesus Christ, his Son, be the sole focus of your heart's allegiance. And may the Holy Spirit fill you with courage to face the uncertainty of the present. Go in peace. Amen.